Okay.
And we are good to go.
Hello, I'm Ginger Coy. I write for Concerning Narcissism when I'm not on sabbatical. Welcome back, viewers and readers alike. I'm here today with Sam Vaknin, and you can find me at gingercoy.substack.com, where I write about proliferating cluster B psychopathology and how it harms civilization. And I think we're in the thrust of it. What do you say, Sam?
Well, yeah, I've been warning against this for decades now. It's
Yes, you
it's
have.
come to pass. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here today. Do you want to introduce yourself more, or how are
Yeah,
you?
I'm Sam Vaknin. I'm an author. I write books about many topics, and among others, I write books about personality disorders. And I'm also a professor of psychology in various places, Cambridge, other places. So
No, it's
that's
quite
that's in a
extensive.
nutshell who I am.
Well, as you mentioned at the top, it's Alligator Alcatraz. We've just passed this dreadful billionaire bill, BBB, big beautiful bill, big billionaire bill. So here we are, and yet they expect us to be patriotic on this 4th of July, this Independence Day in America, somehow, some way. So it's just incredible to me that a wide swath of humanity will double down on a pernicious policy like BBB that harms them. So could you comment on this phenomenon?
Yes, I think people are far less concerned with material well-being. They're far less concerned with having jobs, healthcare, and they're much more concerned nowadays with maintaining their value system. I think we're in the throes of a culture war, a global culture war, where people are willing to sacrifice anything, their livelihood, their prosperity, their prospects, their family, you name it. They're willing to sacrifice anything just to come up on the winning side of this culture war, just to be able to maintain their value system, their beliefs, their faith, and pass it on to the next generations. They perceive this as an existential war, and they're not completely mistaken. I think it is an existential war. So people are going to support MAGA in the States. These are the very same people who are going to lose Medicaid coverage or Medicare coverage later. Or they're going to lose their jobs. They're going to lose everything basically because the vast majority of the voters, the electoral base of Donald Trump recently has become much more impoverished than before. Many more poor people vote for Donald Trump than they have 4 years ago. And these are the very people who stand to be severely harmed by BBB and other legislation. And yet they're fully behind him. They trumpet him, they worship him, they eulogize him, they render him a kind of a divine phenomenon because he's fighting, as far as they're concerned, for their soul. So there's a conflict here between body and soul. Whereas until very recently, let's say until 20 years ago, till about 20 years ago, people were fighting for their bodies. They were fighting for money. They were fighting for food. They were fighting, for corporeal things. I think in the past 20 years, we've been fighting for our souls and the beliefs and values that sustain our souls. In other words, we have transitioned from a materialistic kind of warfare to an axiological and doxastic warfare that is concerned with beliefs and values. It used to be known as, in German, as Kulturkampf, as culture wars. So it's not the first time in human history. It's not even the first time in the past 100 years. You've had massive Kulturkampf, massive culture wars in the 20s and 30s, 1920s, 1930s, and so only about 100 years ago. And so it's wrong to assume, as the Democrats have, and that's why they've lost the election, that's why they've lost the foothold in society, because the Democrats assume that people are rational, they're self-interested. The Democrats adhered to the rational agent theory in economics. Like people are going to make a calculus. What do I stand to gain? What do I stand to lose? In materialistic terms, basically. And then they're going to make the right choice. And the right choice is the Democratic Party. But that was not the calculus. The calculus was they're going to impose gender diffusion or gender confusion or gender disturbance on my children. They're going to take away my faith in a supreme being. They're gonna undermine my family values and other traditional values. They're the enemy. They're endangering, risking my soul. So this is it's a morality play. It's a religious war. And the Democrats fail to understand this. They fail to grasp that we have transitioned to a morality play. They fail to come up with an alternative religion. They insisted on being essentially rational in many ways. And yet the rationality of the Democratic Party was coupled with totalitarianism. It was a tyranny, ideological tyranny. It's and so it was a very noxious concoction. The imposition of values which were alien, essentially European, on the American people, on the one hand, European values, I would even say French values, on the American people on the one hand, and then doing it in a way that has been widely perceived, and justly so, as totalitarian or authoritarian or cultish.
Hmm. It's interesting contrast of the values versus corporeal or bodily concerns that you're outlining there. Uh, so what do you see next is happening in terms of like how political narcissistic abuse was playing out or fascism is playing out in America? How does this end?
I think it would behoove us to define fascism first and foremost. Fascism, like narcissism, like love, like this is among the most molested words in the English language. Fascism is a highly complicated phenomenon. It is not for the faint-hearted and not for the dim-witted. It's a very profound political theory, and anyone who underestimates fascism as the religion of the stupid, they're going to be railroaded by fascism. Fascism is going to end their lives and their livelihoods and so on. So, fascism, I think, has five main components. First of all, it's a permanent revolution. It's a permanent revolutionary state. The revolution is never ending. It's an organizing principle. It's also an explanatory principle. Like if you want to make sense of the world, this ongoing revolution, all pervasive, ubiquitous, and everlasting, makes sense of the world, divides it into camps. So it generates automatically affiliation, belonging, acceptance, an in-group and an out-group, and so on and so forth. It's an organizing principle. The second element in fascism is utopian nihilism, the ingrained belief that destroying everything imbues life with meaning and sense. Fascism is focused on destruction, not even creative destruction, not even, what Schumpeter, the famous economist, called, not this kind of destruction, which is essentially a critical stage towards innovation and renovation and renewal, not this kind of destruction, but total, utter destruction beyond which there's nothing, after which there's nothing. So this becomes nihilism that is utopian. What people might perceive as dystopia is perceived by fascists as utopia. And so utopian nihilism. The third element, I think, is that fascism is reactionary. It pretends to be avant-garde. There's a facade of avant-garde. There's a pretension to avant-garde, but it's essentially highly reactionary. And it is a reaction to the true avant-garde. So it's a clash between the real avant-garde and the fake avant-garde, which is reactionary. And then I think the fourth element of five, worry not, it's about to end. The fourth element is elitist populism. Again, you can immediately see the contradictions, the inbuilt contradictions in fascism, because utopian nihilism, elitist populism. When I say elitist populism, I mean there's a new elite. Fascism always generates a new elite. So, for example, in Nazi Germany, there was the Führer, and the new elite were the SS, and so on. In Soviet Russia, USSR, and yes, communism is a form of fascism, of course. In the USSR, it was the nomenclatura. So there's always an elite, but the elite is committed to the collective. The elite becomes an elite by virtue of self-sacrifice and dedication to the collective. It's a collectivist elite. Not very different to Japan, for example, where a collectivist society gives rise to elites which maintain their status as elites by dedicating or sacrificing themselves for the purposes and aims and goals and benefits of the collective, so the greater good. Still, there is a well-demarcated group which constitute an elite in fascism, always. So in this case, the oligarchy in the United States is emerging as the new fascist elite. The tech brothers, all these people, they're the new fascist elites. Yeah. And the last element in fascism is collective individualism. Fascism is very, very powerful, very resilient, precisely because it's the biggest of big tents. It reconciles and assimilates all possible contradictions. Fascism is not right-wing and not left-wing. It's both. It's absolutely both. Nationalsozialistische Deutsches Arbeiterpartei. That was the official name of the Nazi party. Sozialistische. And so on. That's why I'm saying that communism is absolutely fascism. If you compare Mussolini's fascism, which is the original brand, mind you, with a knockoff in Soviet Russia, you will find many similarities. For example, corporatism of some kind. For example, collective ownership of industries and so on. You find many similarities. So the last element is collective individualism. Collective individualism means you can express your individuality, and you're encouraged to express your individuality within well-defined collective frameworks. It's like the collective dictates to you under which conditions and circumstances you can experience individuality, or you can individuate. Now, it's not the same as an oppressive or suppressive or repressive regime where individuality is proscribed, like it's verboten. You're not allowed to be an individual. Fascism allows you to express individuality. Only the number of ways is more limited than in a totally open society. So there's something for everyone in fascism. That's the secret sauce. That's the source of the appeal. There's something for everyone. If you're a collectivist, if you are a revolutionary, if you are reactionary, if you are an individualistic person, and you're a very January 6th type of person, if you're elitist, if you are populist, if you are a revolutionary, if you are traditionalist, it's all there. It's all there. And so that's why fascism, I think, is far more resilient than democracy, liberal democracy. We can discuss it later if you wish, but I think liberal democracy never stand a chance. I think it's an aberration.
Yeah, I see fascism as throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. Something for everyone, as you pointed out. It also squares, I think, readily with postmodernism, that, my truth is just as good as your truth, and there's no objective truth. So people can hear what they want to hear, this type of thing. Now, you wrote a paper I'm hoping that we can link to in the description about fascism, which you just elucidated, and you spelled out these tensions, which, just to recap for our audience here, was renewal versus destruction, individualism versus collectivism, utopianism versus struggle, and organic versus decadent. Maybe we could speak a little bit more to that, and elitism versus populism.
Yeah, well, that's what I've just done.
Yeah, okay.
I've
Well, I
described the
just
five
organic versus
elements.
decadent was a little bit, yeah. Long.
Organic versus decadent is an interesting tension within fascism, because fascism always degenerates to decadence. There is not a single exception in human history. Fascism is not a new invention. Mussolini gave it kind of aura. Mussolini was a communist, by the way, a prominent communist, before he became a fascist, before he discovered fascism. He was a prominent communist, and he styled fascism. He designed it after communism, after the tenets and structures and institutions of communism. It was an extension of communism, in effect. Also, a
Mhm.
socialist movement. All these, ironically, are socialist movements. And so, it always ends in decadence, but it starts by claiming to be pure, authentic, organic, um, blood and soil in Nazi Germany. The proletariat, the working men so it's always like we are close to nature. And even there is a deification of the human body. For example, in Nazi Germany there was a worship of the human body, very reminiscent of the Renaissance. In It was a Renaissance movement. Fascism is a Renaissance movement because the two pillars of Renaissance were the individual and personality cult, the leader, Machiavelli, yes, the leader.
Yeah,
So these are Renaissance movements. And so you ask me, what do I think is gonna happen next? I think
yeah,
the natural state of human societies, and the very concept of human society is very new, but I think the default state of human societies, the equilibrium, is a fascist state. I think liberal democracy demands too much of people. And I think also that in the particular case of the United States, there has been an imposition of foreign values and foreign beliefs and foreign thought systems on the American people. I think the intellectuals in the United States, especially in the 60s and 70s, they imported mainly from France, but not only, but mainly from France. They imported a variety of edicts and thoughts and beliefs and values and theories and which were ill-suited to the average American, it was a foreign implant, and now we are seeing the immune reaction to it. And I think the Americans are reverting to their roots. In this sense, I do believe that Trump's variant of fascism reflects the real soul of America. This is who Americans are. This is who they've always been. The, the aggression, the reactionary streak, the in-group versus out-group xenophobia and hatred. I mean, hatred of immigrants is nothing new, of course. I don't need to tell you. There have been several cycles in American history of rabid rejection of hatred and demonizing of immigrants and demonizing of immigrants. And you see it in other fascist movements. For example, anti-Semitism is an anti-immigrant, is the first anti-immigrant movement in human history. Because what has happened is the Jews were forced to emigrate. They were forced by the Romans to emigrate from Palestine, and they were dispersed among other people, among other nations, I mean, other population groups. So these populations have rejected them. They've developed an immune reaction to these new immigrants. And so this was the first anti-immigrant movement, anti-Semitism. And it's not a surprise that literally all fascist movements are closely identified with anti-Semitism. It's not a surprise. Because Jews are immigrants, the eternal immigrants, the quintessential immigrants.
Well,
And so,
on this 4th of July, sorry to interrupt. I'm going to defend Americans for a
yeah,
moment here, that we are aspiring to a high bar, what being a melting pot. you've commented on this as well. We're not a nation state with, cohesive body. And so, yes, tensions are going to flare. I think we've done pretty well by ourselves for 250 years, even as bellicose as our orientation is to the world. We've also done a lot of good for the world too. So this is a contemplation of what it means to be an American, and it's good, bad, and ugly, to be fair. But I do appreciate your commentary ongoing on Americans, because I do think it gives us an insight from a European vantage point. So in terms of fascism, and as we round this corner and we're really embracing this, and this is obviously a huge departure from what our founding fathers envisioned for our country. I've been thinking about the role of, and this is very, as you've commented before, American of me and solutions oriented. But as I've taken this sabbatical, I've taken a beat to reflect on where we stand with political narcissistic abuse as is being perpetrated by Trump and his oligarchs. And I'm thinking about the role of love as an antidote to political narcissistic abuse in the expression of fascism, and empathy being a cornerstone of love. Now, I've taken some time, Sam, to look at your videos on empathy, where you've really parsed out a lot of the intellectual misgivings you have around this concept. I don't want to dwell too much in that space because I think it gets into the weeds a little much and too philosophical for the purposes of this video. But I do see empathy as a cornerstone of love. And empathy is, I'm just going to take it at the face value, sort of generic definition of love, that there is, in fact, an external person that we're identifying with. So I wanted your kind of comments on this. And I also want to weave it into these tensions that I think are so helpful for the framing of fascism, because if there is a way in which we can exploit chinks in the armor of these tensions in fascism and punctuate it and perforate it, whatever we need to do to get rid of this fascism so we can get into a more enlightened frame of mind that's more rational, like the Democrats espouse.
So I would beg to differ with a few points you've made. I will not go into them because I respect your leadership in this particular conversation. But I would like to point out where we differ. First of all, I did not imply that America was all bad. I did not use any value judgment whatsoever. I didn't say it's bad or good. I just said that current political movements, in my opinion, are much more aligned with the American soul, if you wish, than the foreign imports from Europe and France, what is known as liberal progressivism. Or this is not American. This liberalism, this progressivism, this is not American. This is French. And so that's my first point. That's all I said. I didn't, of course, America has done a lot of good, absolutely a lot of good, and has contributed mightily to the world and has shaped the world. Hitler and America are the two forces that have shaped the world.
In one breath, okay.
Yeah, in one breath, absolutely. Because everything is nuanced. There's always good and evil. The evil force that has shaped the world that we live in is Hitler, and the good force is the United States. And yes, it is the good force, the force for the good. So I didn't imply otherwise, absolutely not. I also beg to differ with your assertion that the current political climate or ambience is in contravention of or contradiction to the founding fathers. I think the founding fathers were much closer to fascism than to liberal democracy or progressivism. We can have another program dedicated to this.
Sounds like we need one.
But I strongly actually beg to differ. I think they regarded participatory democracy as a serious threat. And that's why they've designed all these institutions, which were absolutely anti-democratic institutions. And they maintained a philosophy in the Federalist Papers and elsewhere that is, not very much removed from fascism. But we can discuss it some other time.
But Sam, we can't just leave our audience hanging like that. So just a nugget
Of course
here.
we can.
Well, I don't want to. I'll be kind. So what you're saying is fascistic to be what, sort of authoritarian and outline sort of, liberal democracy with our founding fathers? I just need a one sentence analysis, please.
I think at the core of fascism is the mistrust of people, the distrust of the people, of people in general, of people like individuals, and definitely the distrust of the mob, of the people. So, and I think the driving force in the thinking of the founding fathers was this mistrust of people. Fascism is founded on mistrust. Liberal progressivism or liberal democracy is founded on trust.
So had it been direct democracy as opposed to participatory, would that have made the difference and not have been as authoritarian or
Well,
fascist?
they have, I don't need to tell you that they've designed institutions which made sure to kind of ameliorate and mitigate the power of the people.
Like
Channel this somehow.
gerrymandering? Yeah.
The Electoral College, for example,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Thank
So
you.
I think that's a distinguishing feature, which, by the way, is relevant to our conversation.
Yeah.
Fascistic people don't trust. People who are fascists don't trust the people. That's why they use force. That's why they use aggression. That's why they use coercion and manipulation and brainwashing, and because they do not trust the people. Whereas liberal Democrats, the progressives, and so on, they come from a position of we trust the people. People are good. If we just give them, the space and the incentives, they would do good. Whereas the fascist says, if you give people freedom, they will abuse it. They will, we can't trust them. We need to incarcerate them within institutions which are highly restrictive and rigid and so on and so forth. So this is where I said that it's utopian nihilism, in the sense that fascism says everything that people have built should be destroyed, because people and the institutions they gave rise to can never, ever be trusted. We cannot trust the Congress, we cannot trust the Supreme Court, we cannot trust democracy, we cannot trust anything. Ironically, not even the family, not even the church. And this is why I keep saying that the founding fathers, in this particular sense, had the mindset of fascists, not of. There was no concept of liberal democracy there was a French Revolution, which has degenerated very quickly to fascism. I mean, if there's a prime example of fascism in the 18th century, it's the French Revolution. With his mass executions, the reign of terror, and so on, and then Napoleon, the Donald Trump of that era, of that period. So this was the only example. There was nothing else. Liberal democracy was 50 years hence. Progressivism was unheard of. The only example you had was ochlocracy, mob rule, where the mob swarmed Versailles, swarmed the Bastille, and killed everyone, and then killed itself, and it was a bloody mess. That was the only example. The American Revolution was an anxiety reaction. When you read the papers, including the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, these are all anxious papers. They're all based on anxiety and catastrophizing, and like how we're going to prevent this from happening and how we prevent this from happening. These are not utopian documents. These are not hopeful documents. These are actually a list of grievances coupled with anxious catastrophizing. That's
So
how
that's interesting. So the underpinning being fascistic and being untrusting, even if it goes into liberal democracy, it's still compromised from the get-go. Is that the bottom line analysis?
America never had liberal democracy. What do you mean? It's never had liberal democracy.
Many of us believe that we've had it, for 250 years. So
You have had a system where people had a voice. They were given a voice. But America never had liberal democracy or progressivism or anything. There was an attempt in the 60s and 70s, which lasted until a few years ago, to superimpose on the American experiment liberal democracy and progressivism imported from Europe. But it was a foreign implant. It was rejected by the body politique of the United States. What America had is a set of institutions which balance somehow the vox populi, the voice of the people, with checks and balances, mainly which were geared mainly to hold back democracy. The checks and balances in the American system are essentially not intended to maintain democracy. They're intended to maintain the power structure. so that none of the elements of the power structure becomes overdominant and topples the whole system.
That's interesting. I've never heard of this sort of inflection point being the 60s in terms of your scheme of things,
Well,
how you're
think
laying it
about
out.
it, the 50s.
Yeah.
Compare the 50s to the 60s. The 50s were a Donald Trump era, essentially. The 50s.
Yes, everyone talks about that, going back to 50s for MAGA. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
While the 60s were a 1968 French thing. It was like 1968.
Mhm.
It was a foreign infection. It was an infection, intellectual infection.
Okay. So going back to my sort of spiel a moment ago, I had mentioned like how do we sort of puncture through, like how do we drive wedges into this sort of fascistic narrative that we're living in, such that we could infuse our culture with love, compassion, empathy, something wholesome. There's
Well,
got
first
to
of all,
be elements we
I
can
fully
exploit.
agree with you. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I fully agree with you. There's no love without empathy. Where I think we differ is you are making the assumption that the antithesis, the antonym of love is fascism.
Yes, I am making that assumption.
Whereas fascism is founded on love and founded on empathy, and I'll try to explain what I mean. What fascism does, it humanizes the in-group and dehumanizes the out-group, and then uses love and empathy as the cohesive glue that endows the members of the in-group with belonging and affiliation and a sense of acceptance. And you ask any MAGA supporter, and they will tell you that Donald Trump loves them. Donald Trump himself keeps saying, I love you. You love me. I love you. I hate the Democrats, he said yesterday. So love and hate, these are the dominant emotions in fascism. The only difference between fascism and other political systems is that fascism is exclusionary, whereas other political systems, most of them, are inclusionary. But all political systems are driven by love. It would be mistaken to assume that fascism is devoid of love. That's
No.
completely untrue.
Fascism has a negative connotation for a reason, however, right? People,
Yes,
by
because
and
it's
large,
exclusionary.
yes, you just tapped into that. That's a great way to put it.
If you don't belong, if you're not in the in-group, you are not deserving of love or empathy.
And it's brutal. I mean, ICE is brutal. They're the Gestapo. I mean, a
Fascism,
concentration camp in Florida, alligator Auschwitz, I'll call it, brutal. So where's the
yes,
love there? Yeah.
fascism externalizes aggression because it's nihilistic. It's
Hmm.
about destruction. So, of course, destruction is a
And yet, from I think where you're coming from, MAGA would view it as this is love for country. We've got to get rid of these immigrants. However, most of these things are wildly unpopular. You know, people don't want El Salvador, Gulag. You know, they don't want
not what I've
ICE.
seen. They're very unpopular among Democrats. That's very true. They're very
But it's not
popular
just
among
among
Republicans.
Democrats. I think Democrats actually represent the wide swath of America. I think this is an aberration. I think MAGA and what they're about is peripheral. I mean, they're an extreme group that have metastasized across our country because by force, by hook or by crook, they've taken over. So that's why I'm just looking for how do we, what are the chinks in the armor here that we can exploit and change things around. Yeah.
The only hope when you're captured, because it's a state capture, when you're
Yes.
captured by fascism, the only hope is that fascism is always centered around a personality cult. There's always a central figure. Remember the elitist populism. So there's always an elite, and the elite revolves around a figure, a human being, an individual. Fascism is never never revolves around an institution. It's not institutional. It's
It's not,
charismatic.
you talked about Weberism the other
Yes, it's
day.
not Weberian. It's
Weberian.
charismatic. It's charismatic. Even in the USSR, there was the charismatic figure of Stalin. When Stalin died, the system collapsed. It took 30 years to collapse, but it collapsed because the charismatic figure was gone. And prior to Stalin, you had Lenin, who was also a charismatic figure. So fascism is a charismatic movement. You remove the leader, the movement dies. It may take a decade to die, or may take a year to die, or may take 3 decades to die, but it dies.
But what do we do in
Fascism
the
is no
meantime
future.
to remove the leader? I mean, that's the chinks in the armor I'm looking for to exploit
There are two
vis-a-vis something
ways
more
to
wholesome.
remove the leader. There are
Yeah.
two ways to remove the leader. One is to expose the leader. So one way is to expose foibles and weaknesses and mistakes and so on of the leader, or to provoke the leader to misbehave in public, or to exposure. And the second way is to wait for the leader to die physically.
He's
Donald Trump,
79, so
Donald Trump dies, you can forget about this chapter in American history. It's done. It's over.
what about the dynasty? You've talked about how
No
America, we have so
dynasty,
many
no,
dynasties.
well, he would like to establish a dynasty and so on. And there may be other instances of fascism in American history. This is not the first one, of course. But this particular MAGA movement is dead because it's not a movement, it's an extension of Donald Trump. Exactly as Nazism has collapsed with Hitler, and fascism with Mussolini, and communism with Lenin and Stalin. They die, the system dies. Another way is to expose the leader, to kind of belittle the leader, to restore reality testing, to somehow open the eyes of people, and so on and so forth. But that is extremely difficult because, first of all, it's perceived as adversarial. Like fascism is constructed around an in group and out group. The more you try to expose the leader, the more there's a line of demarcation, the more there's a boundary between the in group and the out group. The in group becomes more cohesive and more defensive, more protective of the leader. So, and that is the great mistake of the Democrats, that they keep attacking Donald Trump personally. And he's trolling them. He's trolling them. He knows how to push the buttons. He knows how to, and there is a derangement syndrome. I fully agree. But it's
I
provoked by
call
him.
it Trump delusional syndrome for those who think he's
Yes.
the bee's knees. Yeah.
So he's 79. I think the best strategy is to criticize policies, expose the outcomes of policies, and but I think the main strategy is to wait. The cleverest thing to do, the smartest thing to do right now is to wait.
Well, and I
Because
think, Sam, I took your advice to heart along these lines. The last line of where I left off 3 months ago with my writing is we're put in a position to sit back and watch this, chaos unfold. And so here we are, went through Doge and ICE and all this, all these hitting Iran the other day. I mean, we just never know. The political narcissistic abuse is relentless every single day. It's a horror show. So why am I going to hemorrhage my life force energy uncovering a narcissist who's creating all this chaos when we can count on the chaos? And so now I think we're at a sort of an inflection point and a turning point where it's not just about covering for us journalists the minutia of it. It's about what is the long-term thinking. So that's kind of where my headspace is at the moment. I want to Something that's in the zeitgeist that's bothersome to me is, of course, Elon Musk, and that he has pathologized empathy as excessive empathy, or what he calls suicidal empathy. And so here's a quote. He says, "The fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy," adding that liberals and progressives are exploiting a bug in Western civilization, which is empathy response. Um, he says it's weaponized. Can you comment on this, please?
yeah, I I have a very dim view of the alleged intelligence of Elon Musk. I think the guy's an idiot,
Yeah.
and I'm talking clinically. I think he's a very stupid man. He's very rich precisely because he's very stupid. He's too stupid to evaluate the risks. So he charges ahead regardless. And then, of course, in some of the cases, you make money and so on. But he's a stupid person. Stupid in the sense that he's not analytical, he's not synoptic, he doesn't have profundity, he has no background, he has only headline intelligence and so on. So I don't pay much attention to the nonsense that he spews on a daily basis, by the way. I don't pay much attention, but Musk is an excellent example to what happens to fascist movements. It's a fly-by-night kind of thing. He's gone, essentially gone. And regarding the thesis that empathy is weaponized, I think there are instances of ostentatious empathy, fake empathy, such as Greta Thunberg, for example. which I regard as a creepy, nauseating thing, and a narcissist, a rank narcissist. So rather than say that empathy per se is weaponized by bleeding heart liberals and so on,
Yeah.
I don't think that's a correct anamnesis or diagnosis. I think what is happening is that narcissists and psychopaths are leveraging ostentatious displays of empathy, which are deceitful, and then penetrating levels of power or attaining power through these displays. I would be wary not of empathy as such, but of ostentatious empathy. Because ostentatious empathy is a great indication of underlying narcissism and psychopathy. And the problem is not the empathy, of course. It's the narcissism and psychopathy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I disagree with him completely. Empathy is the glue that holds human societies, human collectives, families, even nuclear families. Empathy is a glue that holds absolutely everything together. Take away empathy, and we're doomed as a species. I disagree as to the definition of empathy or the perception of empathy in many minds, but this very uh, creation of an imaginary intersubjective space, an imaginary space which is shared by more than one individual. This is the thing that is holding us together. So to say that empathy is a bug, or it's not a bug, it's a feature. And it's a critical feature. It's the operating system, actually, psychologically speaking. It's absolutely the operating system. And anyone who misperceives this has my pity and my derision and contempt. Um, However, he may be right that displays of empathy, ostentatious empathy, is being weaponized by unscrupulous, callous, ruthless psychopaths and narcissists in order to attain power. And two examples are Elon Musk and Donald Trump, of course, perhaps the prime examples of this.
Mhm. I share your dim view of Elon Musk, especially what with on the heels of doging our country, and the collateral damage is extensive. And deaths that he's perpetrated as a result of USAID being shuttered. At any rate, so I think it's pretty rich for Elon Musk to decry empathy across the board when, in my estimation, he is cluster B and therefore he has cold empathy, if nothing else, himself. So I thought maybe you could comment on cold empathy since we're headed up by so many cluster B folks these days leading the charge versus warm empathy.
Well, I'm the guy who coined the phrase cold empathy, and I deeply regret it. Because
Yeah.
cold empathy, of course, has nothing to do with empathy. When we use the word empathy in colloquial speech, we mean affective empathy, emotional empathy, the ability to resonate emotionally with the imputed state of mind of another person. Mind you, imputed. It's a theory. We call it a theory of mind. The whole process involves what we call mentalizing. So what goes on with real empathy is you make deductions. You create a theory on the fly regarding the state of mind of another person based on cues, behavioral cues, body language, facial expressions, micro expressions, and so on. But the theory is yours. You are the one who is creating the theory. And you're creating it, as I said, on the fly. It's instantaneous, it's an improvisation. And then based on this theory, you attribute to the other person a state of mind, psychological state, and based on this attribution, you experience this psychological state in yourself. You emotionally resonate with the other person. It's actually a reaction to your own theory, to the attribution, not to the other person, because we can't have any access to another person's mind. So you are reacting to your own theory and to your own attribution and so on. And there's a reason why you're doing this. I'm not going into it right now. Still, it's very powerful. And in the vast majority of cases, your theory is probably right. For example, if you see someone crying and you generate a theory that they're sad, and then you
Hmm.
feel sad for them, probably 99% of the time, your theory is right. Okay, so we call this the intersubjective space. Okay, that's the core issue. Cold empathy has no affective or emotional component. It has no inner resonance of any kind. And in this sense, it is not fully internalized. It's more like a theory in physics. You don't, when you create a theory about the sun, you don't internalize the sun. You don't react emotionally to the sun. It's not really internal. It's a computer can generate a theory. Artificial intelligence can generate a theory about the sun. So cold empathy is observation which yields a theory. And because it is founded merely on observation and theory, and that's where it stops, it can, I can easily believe that artificial intelligence would develop cold empathy in due time, which is a major threat, by the way. Because these theories are usually highly correct, it gives you power. You can weaponize this, which is what narcissists and psychopaths do. They create a theories about other people, and then they weaponize these theories. They use them, they leverage them, they penetrate defenses, they exploit vulnerabilities. So nothing is in common with affective or emotional empathy, not the aftermath and not the antecedents. There's nothing in common. It shouldn't be called actually called empathy, I think. It should be
Well,
called
you've defined it as cognitive and reflexive as
cognitive
well,
and
along
reflexive.
along the lines of AI.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Because it's not
Okay.
human. It's not necessarily human. I could conceive of many other systems who could develop and will, in due time, I believe, develop cold empathy. There's no demand or precondition that it should be human. Whereas affective or emotional empathy, I don't believe artificial intelligence would ever have this. Never
Well, for
mind.
what it's worth, Sam, I like the term cold empathy. I think it's a good distinction.
Thank
So in
you.
broad, yes. Okay, so I want to turn to Jung. I know he went off the rails later in life, and I've watched your videos, kind of your take on. But I wanted to explore this notion of and I know this is a value judgment, so bear with me. Okay, has America failed to integrate its shadow and its shadow taken over in much the same way that narcissists project their shadow onto others, creating a toxic societal stew?
Well, I'm all for the concept of shadow, which, by the way, is the repository of what Jung called the complexes, the rejected parts in you. The parts you reject are there if you fail to project them. This is something which not many people realize. When there are parts of you which you intensely dislike, there are three ways open to you, basically. The first way is projection. You can say, it's not me, it's the other guy. Like, I'm not the one who is envious, he is envious of me. I'm not the one who's aggressive, he's aggressive, and so on. So this is projection. Yeah, the second way open to you is reaction formation, completely denying the parts in you that you hate, that you despise, that you reject, that you loathe, and then acting in ways which confirm to you and to others that you are not in possession of these parts. So the most perfect example is someone who is a latent homosexual and becomes homophobic. So by ostentatiously and conspicuously hating on homosexual people, he proves to himself and to others that he is not homosexual. So this is reaction formation. And the third solution is the shadow, is to bury somehow bury or repress these parts of you which you find utterly unacceptable, which you reject, which you are ashamed of, the parts in you which cause you ego dystony, in other words, parts in you which make you highly uncomfortable. And so what you do with these parts, you bury them. There is this swamp or these alligator Alcatraz, where you put all these parts and you never ever get in touch with them. This is the shadow. And these parts are known as complexes. And I fully agree with you on this. And I think um, in the United States, the flirtation with the shadow is an integral part of the ethos of the United States. Forever, like from its very inception, there was a flirtation with the shadow. The shadow has sometimes been embraced as an engine of growth, as a force forward, as a motivational, attitudinal source of energy. Whereas other civilizations and cultures have repressed the shadow, deplored the shadow, ignored the shadow, projected it onto others, or whatever. In the United States, the shadow often rears its head, ugly or not, and is perceived as not only legitimate but beneficial, a benefactor force, a force for the good. And so you can find it in literature, you can find it in, I mean, Updike, Fitzgerald, you can find it in the arts, but you can definitely also find it in politics, and even I would say in political thinking and political science and so on and so forth. Many American schools in psychology and sociology and so on and so forth seek to integrate the shadow by partly legitimizing it, by trying to see the positive aspects of having a shadow, leveraging the shadow, using the shadow, and so on. This is unique to the United States. I personally am not aware of any other civilization who has done this as a foundational principle, with one exception, and that would be Nazi Germany. I'm not aware of it, but Nazi Germany was an aberration and it was taken to extreme where the shadow became the dominant force. It was all defined by. It's not the case in America, of course. I'm not saying that America is a shadow civilization, shadow-based civilization like Nazi Germany. But in America, the shadow is not totally rejected. And you can see it in Donald Trump's speeches and so on and so forth, where he is sometimes embracing what we would call the shadow. And other people, the millions who are watching him, are reactive positively to this. Yesterday, I saw, for example, Donald Trump saying, Democrats hate me, and I hate them too. And I hate them because they hate America. And they essentially, he implied that they should die or should be expelled from America. And there was this crowd, pretty big crowd, and they were all cheering on. This is a shadow statement, if any. They're all cheering on. But it's not limited to Donald Trump. I think I can point to many, many instances in American history where the shadow was embraced as integral part of appropriate thinking, of the correct way forward, of the right way forward, of engendering the kind of energy which would induce change, which essentially would prove to be beneficial. And one instance, for example, is the deliberations between Truman and his advisors, and between Truman and himself, on whether to drop the nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb or not. It's a perfect example of wrestling with the shadow and finally accepting the shadow as the right solution, the right thing, the right motivation. It's fascinating, by the way, all the moral struggle. It's like Israel and the angel, fight between Israel and the angel in the Bible. The moral struggle inside Truman's own psyche and with his advisors and so on whether to drop the bomb or not. Today we know, of course, that it was far from necessary. At least the second one was far from necessary. But at the time, you see this clash between small town provincial morality, where he came from, and suddenly having to grapple with what Oppenheimer, when he created the atomic bomb, he said, we have the famous saying from the Rig Veda. He said that we have unleashed death. So they've all unleashed the shadow. The whole Manhattan Project and the use of the atomic bomb is a perfect example of what I'm saying, of the usage of the shadow as a driving force, which essentially is for the greater good. And this is unique to America. I don't know of any other civilization that has this.
Okay, so to recap here, we Americans, we've been flirting with the shadow. So in that respect, we acknowledge it
Mm.
and not projecting it. So uh, So we can't say that we failed to integrate our shadow, and that's what fells us.
You don't see the need. You don't see the need to integrate it. You regard it as an integral part of yourself anyhow. Part of your identity is this
I didn't
shadow.
know if it was projecting or if it was shadow. And to me, maybe I haven't studied Jung enough to know how do you delineate, how do you demarcate, how do you know that Trump, and as you just mentioned in the speech, is not just projecting his own damage onto us, and or is he acknowledging the shadow in the
Well,
room?
I think Americans are very grounded, very realistic. I think the project of getting rid of the shadow or reframing the shadow, so I think it's a highly idealistic and counterfactual and nonsensical project, honestly.
So in this respect, it's healthy that we're
It's healthy,
acknowledging.
yes.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
sorry if I didn't make it clear.
No, I'm for
I
audiences.
think absolutely,
Yeah,
yes. I think the American psyche in this sense is much healthier than the European psyche. Definitely. The
interesting.
Europeans are what Freud would have called neurotic, whereas Americans sometimes are psychotic, but I mean, by and large, Americans are much healthier, mentally speaking, than Europeans. In this sense, collectively speaking, of course. And
That's
that's
a
why, for
refreshing
example, you have
take.
the
Yeah,
gun
well,
culture, which is unthinkable in Europe. That's why
as
you
it should be here. Yeah, go ahead.
so that's why you have so many things which are in Europe and other civilizations would have been considered indications
Yeah.
of evil, pure unmitigated evil. But you don't regard it as pure unmitigated evil. You regard it as a manifestation and expression of human nature. You're much more realistic about human nature, which is a secret for your success, if you ask me.
Thank
Why
you.
America has succeeded, ultimately, beyond anyone's wildest imagination, is that America has always remained grounded in reality. I mean, we're evil, we're good, we're nuanced, we're gray, we're never.
As I said earlier, good, bad, and ugly. It's all the above.
Europe has a splitting defense. That one of the main reasons that the importation of European values and beliefs onto American soil, one of the main reasons this import has failed spectacularly is because a European value, especially French values and beliefs, are founded on splitting. There is, if you're not for it, you're all evil. It's if you're not for a set of beliefs or a set of values, so that's the tyranny. That's the ideological tyranny, and it's alien to American nature. Americans are highly realistic about people. They know that people are sometimes good and sometimes evil. They know that in this sense, Americans in some ways are more forgiving of human nature and in some ways less forgiving of human nature because Americans realize that people are much stronger than they appear to be. And so they have the choice. They make choices on the one hand. And on the other hand, Americans accept that some of these choices are going to be evil and wrong and so on. There is an acceptance of humanity, of what makes us human in America, whereas there is a rejection of what makes us human in Europe. And when you tried, the American intellectuals, when they tried to impose this rejection of elements of humanity on the American people, the result is Donald Trump. So American people, the American people, I mean, a big part of the American people perceive Donald Trump as much more human with all his foibles and all his idiocy, pronounced idiocy, and he's human. Trump is perceived as human, whereas many intellectuals in Harvard or wherever, they're perceived as inhuman, not fully human, unforgiving in many ways, tyrannical. The woke movements, the victimhood
Yeah.
movement, these are movements that idealize people, and people are never ever ideal. If you ask people to conform to an ideal, you're setting them up for failure. And they resent you for this. They hate you for this, which is what American intellectuals have been doing in the past 40, 50 years. They've been setting up people for failure and then holding them in contempt for having failed, you know? I expect you to never lie, and then if you lie, you're a failure, and I hold you in contempt for lying. But people lie all the time, according to many studies, most of the time, actually. They lie. That's it. That's what people do. And that's what Donald Trump symbolizes, an acceptance. That's what
Mm,
people do. He's going to be
right.
evil. He's going to hate on you. That's because that's what people do.
So getting back to my framing, and I hear you that fascism is not necessarily, speaking of splitting defense, not necessarily, it's kind of the natural order of things. So we can't necessarily say it's bad categorically, right? However, it is kind of a good mnemonic or like sort of contrast, right? So love versus fascism. So I wanted to talk to you also, because I know you've spoken at length about the role of eros and libido in a functioning society, and do they have a part to play in the scheme of things?
That's what I would advise you. And of course, you're at liberty to reject my advice. I will cry and cut my wrist and do horrible things to myself, but still you're at liberty to cause me pain. But seriously, my advice is perhaps
Yep.
to consider um, contradiction between inclusion or inclusionary and exclusionary. Not so much love, because there's a lot of love in fascism, but it's exclusionary love. So the contradiction is a bit, in my view, it doesn't sound right. I think it's more about including people and excluding people. Fascism is definitely about excluding people, whereas liberal democracy and so on is about including people.
And can
At
you say
least,
that love is about including people too? I mean, because really,
yeah, it is in
Sam,
theory.
inclusion and exclusion is not going to sell books. Like,
Yeah, it is in theory. It's in theory about inclusion. The big problem with liberal democracy and so on is that it is degenerated into ideological tyranny and became in many ways fascistic, many ways. But okay, well, we'll keep to your language. Um, you're talking about
eros and libido,
eros and
yes.
libido, yeah. So libido is a component of eros. Libido is essentially the sex drive, and eros is the life force, what the French called élan vital, like in the work of Bergson, Henri Bergson, and so on. He called it élan vital, the force of life. So it is a belief that sexuality drives the wish to survive and because of reproduction and so on and so forth. And therefore, it is a critical component in the force of life. That has been negated almost instantaneously by most of his disciples, like Jung and Adler. And I mean, they completely disagreed with him. They wanted sexuality gone. But Freud's big contribution was to suggest that we are confronted with a choice whether to embrace the force of life or to deny it. At the time, initially, he did not come up with the idea of the force of death, Thanatos, the Thanatic force. That was a much later development. He plagiarized it from others, as usual. But he did, he did suggest that the source of all mental illness is a rejection of life, of the force of life. Later on, thinkers like Harvey Cleckley, who was a clinician so Cleckley wrote about psychopathy. He wrote The Mask of Sanity, which is a foundational, seminal text. And Cleckley also said it all boils down to a rejection of life. When you reject life, eros means that you embrace life. Eros means that you make life the affirming energy, the motivational, attitudinal landscape within which you operate. It means that you reject all the alternatives to life. And there's not a single alternative to life. Death is one alternative, but there are many others. For example, you could constrict yourself. You could lock yourself in a room, never ever to leave. That's a rejection of life. Today, majority of people, according to Pew Center, at least 42%, but probably much more. That's exactly what they're doing. They lock themselves in small, tiny cubicles. They watch Netflix and have two pets. And so this is a constriction of life. It's a rejection of life, of course. Our atomized civilization is a death cult, not a life cult. So there are many ways to reject life, not necessarily by committing suicide or dying, many ways.
Getting into a narcissistically abusive relationship is a
Yes,
rejection.
yes, it's a form of self-harming. Trauma bonding is a form of self-harming. Fascism is a rejection of the totality of life. Fascism reserves life to its adherents, but rejects life. for everyone else. Ultimately, it decays, it becomes decadent, and then it's a rejection of life, period. So there are many ways to reject life. What Freud was trying to say is that if we affirm and celebrate life repeatedly, we are likely to guarantee positive outcomes both individually and collectively. And if we in any way reject life, constrict it, restrict it, suppress it, deny it, fight it, reframe it, or whatever, then we would definitely have guaranteed negative outcomes individually and collectively. And that's an amazingly perspicacious insight. I think he was very right. I think we are embedded in a death cult. One of the manifestations of this death cult is consumerism, where we value inanimate objects over people. We sacrifice people, sometimes physically, in order to maintain material benefits or material goods. We are transitioning from an animate civilization, a civilization of animated objects, to a civilization of inanimate objects. And we are rendering ourselves inanimate. We are objectifying ourselves. And so fascism is ideally suited to this because, as I mentioned, it's about nihilism. And it's also ideally suited because the collective gaze objectifies you. The collective gaze, whereas in other systems, it is the individual's gaze that gives rise to your sensation of being seen. You're being seen through the individual, through another individual's gaze, which is also a great definition of empathy, by the way. So in fascism, the only way you feel seen is via the collective. The individual gaze loses its power in fascism. Only the collective gaze gives rise to a sense of becoming, to a sense of being. So fascism is about collective being, collective existence. You can exist only via the collective. If you are divorced from the collective, if you're cast out of the collective, if you betray the collective, or if the collective changes in ways which you cannot accept, cannot conform with, at that moment, your existence is denied externally, but also internally. You also feel that you do not exist anymore. And so, if you ask me what is the greatest damage of fascism, it's not the Auschwitzes and it's not the people survive everything. Ask Viktor Frankl. People survive.
Unless they died in the Holocaust, but okay, yes, go ahead.
Okay, not individuals, but people.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Individuals don't survive, but people survive, Nothing but the greatest damage of fascism is the denial of the individual gaze, is ultimately disempowering the individual, is the insistence on the only source of legitimacy, on the collective as the only source of legitimacy, and not just any collective, but a highly specific exclusionary collective. That is a catastrophic development on the individual level, and on the species level or collective level. Catastrophic development because the gaze is hijacked. There's a hijacking of the gaze. And it is hijacked usually by a single individual. Hitler, Donald Trump. This single individual becomes the source of the gaze. That's why the Republican Party in Congress, they become animated through Donald Trump's gaze. If he doesn't gaze on them, they are inert. They're dead. Not a single piece of legislation has passed this Congress. Would you realize this? Except the BBB.
Do you think this is a compensatory, the collectivism of fascism as a counterpoint to the atomization? Because it's quite paradoxical to me. We could find ourselves in this sort of tech-driven fascist state of things.
No, I think atomization is a major source of power for modern fascism.
Okay.
And Hitler understood this. Hitler introduced modern technology.
Like divide and conquer?
Um,
And what?
it's creating the most powerful collectives imaginable. Hitler could only dream of this power. You could now use technology or leverage technology to create protean, ever-changing collectives, which are amorphous, ethereal, ephemeral, and yet always there, omnipresent. And these collectives can be communicated to individuals via modern technology, and there is no need for physical proximity or physical interaction whatsoever. On the very contrary, the individual feels empowered via the collective gaze of the technology. So it is the technology that becomes the repository of the leader's gaze. The leader's gaze is now a distributed network, a distributed system, whereas Adolf Hitler, poor Adolf Hitler, had to be there physically, scream his
He
head
made use
off.
of technology, though. He was pioneering.
I
We also
said, I said that he introduced
yeah,
modern technology,
yeah,
introduced the microphone, introduced the airplane, introduced television,
right.
among the first to introduce television. But it wasn't enough. What we have done now is we have rendered the gaze distributed. We now have a distributed gaze via technological means, and the gaze reaches each and every individual on a highly specific channel, and yet it is still the gaze of the leader. So the empowerment, the power that the technology affords, technology gives to fascism nowadays is unprecedented in human history. Unprecedented, and the only remote parallel I can think of, remote, is the use that Martin Luther has made of the printing press. It's the only remote parallel I can think of. Because Martin Luther used the printing press to create a gaze, create a framework that he then distributed to millions of people all over Northern Europe. And that's the only parallel I can think of.
Mhm.
But it's nothing, printing press is nothing compared to Twitter or to, nothing. I mean,
Yeah.
Twitter is like,
I'm going to get back to love. And so you've talked about how narcissistic abuse can be ruinous for one's health. And what about the absence of love along these same lines? Isn't that ruinous? I mean, again, it's like a study of contrast, right? You got narcissistic abuse on one hand and the absence of love, or love. And so I wanted you to comment on that, and also your article, which I hope we can link to as well in the description, about pathology of love, that it's an addiction.
yeah, again, I don't think there's an absence of love. I think there is a reallocation or redistribution of love in fascism. Love is monopolized in fascism. Love is no longer a public good, it's a private good. Love is hoarded. Love is stored in repositories and then dispensed or distributed the same way food is distributed in Gaza, the same way.
Limited. Mhm.
So fascism is about the monopolizing of love and the distribution of love to highly specific, eligible adherents, denying it to everyone outside the in-group. And technology allows love to be replicated and amplified nowadays. Modern technologies like social media and so on allow love to be amplified and so on. And there is a sense of one-on-one. And so, but I wouldn't say that love is denied, or I would say that it is expropriated in a way. Everyone in the outgroup not only is denied love, but experiences hate. See, so fascism is not about, okay, we're going to love the in-group and we're going to ignore the out-group. Fascism is about, we're going to love the in-group and we're going to exterminate, eliminate, annihilate, repress the out-group. We hate the out-group. In many ways, fascism is what we call negative identity formation. Who are you as a supporter of Trump? You are not a liberal. You are not a progressive. It's because fascism is nihilistic. It has no agenda. It's nihilistic. It creates negative identity formation. But then for negative identity formation to exist, you must have a contrast between total love and total hate, total love and total hate. And but fascism is exclusionary, and at the same time, it's missionary. So fascism tells you all you have to do is support and love Donald Trump ostentatiously, and you're one of us. And you will experience all the love that you need. So it's not like, this is it and entrance denied. The doors are wide open. And in this sense, fascism, of course, is reminiscent of religion. You just convert and you will enjoy the kingdom of heaven.
And I think in my question, I was putting narcissistic abuse in for fascism per se. Because if you're a narcissist, you're incapable of love. And so then we live in a narcissistic or borderline narcissistic psychopathy culture, right? So where does that leave the rest of us? Is this antiquated, this notion of love? Are we completely outdated because they set the tone at the top? These
Again, I
psychopaths?
repeat, fascism is not about absence of love. But what I agree with you is that fascism is a shared fantasy.
Mhm.
That's where I agree with you. Fascism is highly reminiscent of the narcissist shared fantasy. Fascism is founded on hagiography, so in this sense it's religious, but it's also founded on a kingdom of heaven. It's, as I said, utopian. The nihilism itself, the destruction itself is the utopia. And so there's a fantasy there. There are founding texts, there are renditions of crucial figures, especially the leader, which are completely divorced from reality. So there's an impaired reality testing. The shared fantasy is about aggrandizement, not only of the leader, but aggrandizement of anyone and everyone who belong. So there's aggrandizement and so on. So where I would agree with you that there is narcissistic abuse in this sense is that fascism imposes a shared fantasy on its followers. And when you enter this shared fantasy, you have to suspend your reality testing. You're being gaslit. So there's a lot of gaslighting. You have to accept the tenets of the fantasy as real, and uh, you're under some kind of oppression. You're afraid to be you, you spend yourself. There's self-denial, a lot of self-denial involved. In this sense, it's highly abusive. Fascism is abusive. I agree. But any ideological tyranny is abusive. For example, I consider the cancel culture to be highly abusive. So whenever you deteriorate, whenever you degenerate into ideological tyranny, left or right, it's fascism. The
Well, yes,
core
and you
issue
know
is
I agree with you along these lines. I don't like the authoritarianism of the woke movement, which seems by and large dead at this point. But it's interesting to me as we kind of parse this that we're talking about narcissistic abuse being a fantasy, and then love is real. So even the love that you're espousing within fascism is that it's not real.
no,
So
I didn't say it's real.
yeah,
I said there
it's
is an
diluted.
experience of love.
Hmm.
The people embedded in the shared fantasy
Right.
experience love.
But
So
it's delusional. It's not real.
fascism um, is founded on love for the members of the in-group.
Okay.
However, because fascism is divorced from reality, everything in fascism is a simulacrum, is a simulation. Fascism is a simulation, it's not real. That's why fascism keeps failing all the time. There hasn't been a single instance of fascism which ended up successfully, with the exception maybe of Franco in Spain. And even this is debatable. And I don't think he was a fascist at all. He was more of a monarchist, though. But leave that aside. Except Franco, I cannot think of a single instance. And and that's because fascism is divorced from reality. Everything inside fascism is unreal. The love is unreal. The only thing I think is that is pretty real is the hate for others, the hate for the outgroup is real. So you could say that
And
fascism,
that's consistent with narcissism. I mean, right
yes,
there.
you could
Yeah.
say that fascism is a hate fantasy. It's a hate fantasy. And in order to maintain the cohesion of the fantasy and the cohesion of the adherents to the fantasy, there is a simulation of love, a simulacrum of love, directed internally, inwardly. And that is in order to maintain the energy of hate. Fascism without hate dies. Fascism requires external enemies all the time, generates them, invents them, creates them. I mean, it's a perpetual mobile of enemies and so on. So if you were to ask me what's the dominant authentic emotion in fascism, it's hate, of course.
Mhm.
And what's the dominant structure in fascism? It's fantasy. And what about other emotions within fascism? Like everything else within fascism, it's a simulation. It's a simulacrum. You know? The leader is a simulation. Is Donald Trump a leader? It's a caricature. It's a caricature of a leader. People project onto him all kinds of things. He's a blank screen. Project onto him. And so he becomes a fantasy figure, and fantasy action figure. You know? It's all fantasy. Is the Republican Party in Congress a real party? It's not.
It's a
It's a
death
fantasy.
cult. They're all about death and money. That's the two
It's a
tenets.
fantasy, and it's also
Yeah.
a fantasy because a real party is active. It pushes back against other branches of government. It introduces legislation. But it's a simulation of a party. Everything degenerated in the Republican camp. Everything has degenerated into a fantasy because they found reality unpalatable. They couldn't cope with reality anymore, these people. They couldn't. They just couldn't. Some of them felt that they are being held in contempt. Some of them felt subjugated by some kind of ideological tyranny. Some of them felt threatened. They all felt bad. They couldn't cope with the reality of what they called the left, the reality of the left. So they deserted. They abandoned the field. They didn't abandon the left. They didn't abandon woke movements. They didn't abandon victimhood movements. They didn't abandon any of this. They abandoned reality. The big story of the Trump movement, the big story of MAGA, is that it has been an abandonment, a movement for abandoning reality, because reality was no longer tolerable and bearable. So they created a fantasy land, fantasy space, where reality, the reality of that fantasy space, which was, of
Mhm.
course, fantastic, was acceptable to them. They could survive there, survivable. In this reality, within this imaginary space, within this simulacrum, they felt loved. They felt seen. They felt safe. They felt catered to, and so on. And in order to experience this sense of safety, this sense of belonging, this sense of certainty, they were willing and are willing to sacrifice anything. Their healthcare
This goes
insurance,
back to BBB. Exactly. Mhm.
yes, their welfare, you name it, they would sacrifice anything because there is nothing that terrifies people more than the feeling that you are unsafe. That uncertainty gives rise to anxiety, and anxiety is the major destabilizing force in the human psyche. People would do anything to avoid anxiety. I would generalize and say that Trump's genius is that he created an anxiolytic movement, a movement that reduces anxiety, takes care of anxiety.
Seems counterfactual somehow for some people. It works.
Yes.
So, just to round out our conversation today, I know you've had a lot of videos about gender dynamics and how the kids aren't having sex these days. And so, lack of eros, like what's going on with this lack of love is sort of the societal glue or empathy. If you could comment on that.
We both agreed that there is a rejection of life.
Hmm.
Sex, and this is where I agree actually with Freud and not with his detractors. I think sex is a major symptom of life. Like if life is a disease, sex is the symptom. So I think when people reject sex, they're rejecting life. And if you reject sex, and by implication life, you're incapable of love, and you see no need for empathy. And then the natural order, the natural organizational principle would be to isolate yourself. Because if you reject life and sex, and why do you need other people? Other people become a liability.
Hmm.
There's an investment in other people which gives no fruits and yields nothing. The return on investment is negative. So why would you seek other people? So this leads to atomization and so on and so forth. I think this is an inexorable process. The minute we reject life, no, it starts with reality. The minute you reject reality, by definition, you reject life. The minute you reject life, you reject all the symptoms and manifestations and expressions of life. like love, like sex, like empathy, and so on. And then, having rejected all these, you reject the social structure itself, society itself, because it's no longer beneficial. It doesn't make sense. It's not rational. It's irrational. It's much better to isolate yourself and become self-contained and self-sufficient, and that's it. Why do you need any of this?
Yeah. Back to your article on fascism I referenced earlier, you closed it out by saying, I'm going to quote you here, that we no longer accept our common fate and the need to collaborate to improve our lot is nothing short of suicidal. Is this need to collaborate predicated on empathy and love, or is it just practical?
No, I think it's practical, but I think where the debate is, some people believe, including the tech brothers, tech bros, yeah, believe that technology has truly rendered us self-sufficient and self-contained. And therefore, society has become either superfluous or we need to redesign society in fundamental, profound ways for it to make sense. Like society as it is now does not make sense. Why it doesn't make sense? Because we don't need it anymore. Technology has rendered us gods. We're godlike. So now we need a new type of society. If at all, maybe not. Maybe not. So this is one part of the debate, one camp. And the other camp, it says um, this this belief that we no longer need to collaborate and work with each other because technology has made it unnecessary is wrong and therefore suicidal in the long run. Because if we don't collaborate with each other, if we atomize ourselves, if we immerse ourselves in totally imaginary spaces like the metaverse or like the MAGA movement, the metaverse and the MAGA movement are flip sides of the same coin. If we do this, we will lose the capacity to collaborate and we will not be ready to deal with contingencies. No one can guarantee a smooth functioning, smooth arc of history. No one. We need to preserve this capacity to work together just in case. And if you give up on this major asset, sooner or later, for example, COVID-19, you're going to find out that you gave up on the existence of the human species. I belong to the second camp, firmly belong to the second camp. I think the tech bros and all these, Peter Thiels and Elon Musk's and so on, I think they are narcissists and inevitably they're spinning shared fantasies. I think these fantasies have nothing to do with reality. They're not grounded. They're totally insane and veritably stupid in majority of cases. And I think regrettably, there's a confluence between one type of fantasy, which is the political fantasy, and another type of fantasy, which is the technological fantasy. And these two feed on each other. They are mutually reinforcing, and they render the very idea of fantasy as a great substitute for reality. They render this idea, which would have been laughable 20 years ago, suddenly it becomes respectable and legitimate. Like people say, actually, why do we need to be in reality? Why do we need reality? Like, what if we are in the metaverse? We can work in the metaverse, we can have sex in the metaverse, we can. Why do we need reality? Or why do we need to take into account other people's preferences and priorities and emotions and conditions? We don't need. We can be fascists, or we can be MAGA, members of the MAGA movement. Or we can destroy everything. Why do we need institutions, actually? We can destroy everything. The minute you divorce reality, nothing in reality makes sense and nothing in reality is immune to nihilism. Nothing. So this is a nihilistic thing. Fantasies are always nihilistic. One of the great mistakes of the 18th century, great, huge mistake. I trace, you know very well that I trace many of these issues to the Enlightenment and to the Renaissance. I think the Enlightenment and the Renaissance got it disastrously wrong in many ways. But one of the huge mistakes of the Enlightenment was the belief that fantasies could supplant reality and succeed even more than reality. That reality sucks reality is somehow flawed and defective, and that we could fix it. Like we could fix it. It was a fix-it movement, you know? The Enlightenment was a fix-it movement. Using our reasoning and the God-gifted rationale that we have, ratio that we have, we can now fix reality. How do we fix reality? We superimpose on it an artificial environment, a fantasy. They called it utopia. But what is utopia? Utopia, a place that does not exist. It was doomed to failure, this whole experiment with fantasy. And then we started to spin fantasies. We had communism, we had fascism, we had Nazism, we had liberalism. These are all fantasies. They're all fantastic spaces. This is a giant mistake. The Enlightenment made two mistakes: demanding of people what they could not deliver, creating resentment and hatred, and the belief that reality is utterly dispensable, and that using our brain, this enormous machinery, we can somehow geoengineer or terraform reality into a new planet of our own making. H.G. Wells, of course, in The Time Machine, described this and the inevitable consequences. So these were the mistakes of the Enlightenment. Fascism is an extension of the Enlightenment. Make no mistake about it. Fascism is the marriage of the Enlightenment with the Renaissance. Make no mistake about it. Somewhere in the 15th century, 16th century, we've gone wrong. We took the wrong fork in the road, and we are still walking. There's this belief that we are now much more advanced, postmodern, I don't know, another bullshit. We are still there, walking.
We like to think that, progress is linear, but you talked about in the Renaissance in one of our video interviews about how it's cyclical, that things burn out under the weight of corruption. I feel that these days.
Yeah.
Do you think we're going through societal collapse? Is this what the Dark Ages looks like? Because you've also prognosticated that, or Ross,
Yes, I think we're in a period of transition, definitely, between reality and fantasy.
Mhm.
Reality is the organizing principle, and fantasy is the organizing principle. And now we face a choice. We seem to be choosing fantasy, which would doom us to a period of the darkest of dark ages and possibly worse. I cannot rule out extinction or massive extinction. So we seem to be choosing fantasy. If we wake up and we revert to reality, then maybe things will be okay. But I'm not optimistic because is fantasy is a bait. It's very luring. Fantasy dispenses with all the sharp edges of reality, with all the painful moments and aspects of reality. Fantasy is designer. It's a designer, finally, there's a designer universe,
Like a drug. Mm-hmm.
So
And
it's
Peter Thiel doesn't
definitely,
really believe that humans should exist. I mean, you're talking about like a neurochip or Neuralink chip in our brain with Elon Musk. And so these tech bros, they're conceiving a future where humans with all their frailties and foibles are just irrelevant in the face of this awesome technology we've developed. So to the point where we could just eradicate. I mean, I think that's what this systematized eugenics is about.
I'm a speciesist. I support my species. Yes, I am.
Or humanist too, right? I mean,
Humanist, yes. I firmly support my species. And I think that's another fantasy. The belief that, for example, artificial intelligence at one point would be able to supplant or replace humanity, or substitute for it. There is, of course, the assumption that artificial intelligence would have no trace of humanity in it, whereas we keep forgetting humans designed it. So, of course, it would have traces of humanity, more than traces, like, shall we say, 90%. So, yes, it will be silicon-based or something else, titanium, I don't know what, but it will be human. There's no way to avoid this. Whatever technology we create is human and will always be human, even if all of us die, yourself and myself included.
well, maybe that's a good way to close this out because the embrace of life, libido, eros, is a counterpoint to these tech bros who are nihilistic and peddling fantasy.
Yeah, I think I am hoping for a counterculture or counter movement or that will somehow reclaim life, somehow reclaim life. We need to get rid of many technologies, or of the exaggerated usage of many technologies. We need to reframe the political arena. We need to avoid extremism left and right, ideological tyranny. We need to finally see other people. That's why I agree with you that empathy is the key. You see, if the Democrats saw other people, there would have been no MAGA. And not
I
only,
think if woke didn't exist, there would be no MAGA.
yeah,
That
but
10% or so of this of the far left has
yeah,
skewed things such.
the Democrats didn't see people like my father, who was a construction worker and so on. They didn't see these kind of people. They were invisible to them.
They were the party of the working class, but not really because they
Yeah,
took
not
from
anymore,
money
not by
donors.
far.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
party of the intellectuals. So I think if we begin to see other people, most of these things will vanish. The fascism, MAGA, tech bros, I mean, all these things, if we finally see each other, we need
Yep.
to be seen. I keep saying in my lectures that the basic primordial survival strategy is to be seen. If a baby is not seen, it's a dead baby sooner or later. The first thing we do, age 6 days, is we cry. We want to attract attention. We need to be seen. And so if you hold people in contempt, if you look down at them, if you ignore them, if you pretend that they are nothing but numbers or statistics and so on, they don't feel seen, and they don't feel seen. This alienates them, they atomize, they isolate themselves, and they give up their power to a leader. And the leader's gaze defines them. They feel seen.
They're calling him daddy now, which is what you had been saying all
That
along.
that is good. I
Paternal.
mean, they are calling him second coming. I mean, I'm kidding you not. I've seen. I mean, he's a second coming. This is
Well, wish
mind-boggling.
us well this Independence Day weekend.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Sam. It's always enlightening, and I really appreciate all your intellect and everything you bring to the table. It's just awesome. So thank you. It's really good to
Thank
see
you,
you.
Ginger. Thank you for your patience. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Happy Independence Day. Yours, at least.
Okay, thank
Bye.
you. Bye.